The night shift had always been a source of dread for me. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights, the eerie silence, and the endless expanse of empty hallways combined to create an atmosphere that was both unsettling and oppressive. But I needed the job, so I endured the loneliness of those long, solitary nights. My shift began at midnight, just as the world outside slipped into its deepest slumber. I was the only living soul in the hospital during those hours, or so I thought. The hospital, an egging behemoth of a building, had seen its fair share of pain and suffering. It stood as a silent witness to countless births and deaths, and its very walls seemed to retain the memories of all those who had passed through its doors. One night, as I sat at my desk in the dimly lit nurses' station, I heard the faintest of whispers. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of my tired mind, a figment of my imagination brought on by the loneliness of the night. But then, I heard it again. Clearer this time, and undeniably human. "Help me," the voice whispered, its tone filled with desperation. I froze in my chair, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice had come from the direction of the old psychiatric ward, a place that had been abandoned for years. No one should have been in there, and certainly no one should have been whispering for help. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way down the darkened corridor toward the psychiatric ward. The hallway was lined with closed doors, their peeling paint and rusted doorknobs adding to the eerie atmosphere. I pushed open the door to the ward and stepped inside. The room was bathed in an eerie greenish glow from the emergency exit sign above the door. The stale air hung heavy with the scent of decay. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, I noticed something strange. A figure huddled in the corner, obscured by shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond, but continued to emit low, pitiful sobs. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the figure cautiously. When my flashlight beam landed on the person's face, I gasped in horror. It was a woman, her eyes empty and hollow, her skin pallid and covered in grime. She wore a tattered hospital gown, and her matted hair hung in greasy strands. But what disturbed me most was the look of terror etched onto her face. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she recoiled, letting out a guttural, inhuman shriek. She lunged at me, her nails like claws, and I stumbled back in terror. I turned and fled the psychiatric ward, slamming the door shut behind me. The woman's cries grew fainter as I retreated down the darkened hallway. I rushed back to the nurses' station, my heart racing, and immediately called security. They arrived quickly, but when we returned to the psychiatric ward, the room was empty. There was no sign of the woman, no trace that she had ever been there. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I kept hearing whispers, faint voices, and the distant echoes of cries for help. But every time I investigated, I found nothing. The hospital seemed to come alive with unseen forces, and I was trapped in its nightmare. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the windows, I couldn't wait to leave that cursed place behind. I handed over my duties to the day shift nurse and stumbled out of the hospital, exhausted and shaken to my core. In the days that followed, I couldn't forget that night. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a product of exhaustion and fear, but the memory of the woman's face haunted my dreams. I couldn't escape the feeling that something malevolent lurked in the depths of the hospital, something that only emerged in the dead of night. And then, a week later, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the envelope in shaky handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sentence written in the same handwriting. "Thank you for coming. We're not alone in the dark." I never returned to that hospital, and I quit my job without hesitation. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something had reached out to me from the other side that night, something that had been trapped in the shadows for far too long. And I can't help but wonder if I had unknowingly set it free. My name is David, and for years I was a prison guard working the night shift at the notorious Black Ridge Penitentiary. It was a grim place, where the shadows seemed to have seeped into every corner. I've witnessed countless horrors within those cold, unforgiving walls. But one night would forever haunt my dreams. The night in question began like any other. As I took my post, I exchanged nods with my fellow guards, all of us hardened by the daily routine of watching over hardened criminals. The hallways echoed with the clinking of chains and the distant murmurs of inmates in their cells. The prison was alive with its own dark energy, and I was just a small cog in the machine. My patrol took me through the long, narrow corridors, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. It was a lonely job, one that left me with only my thoughts and the occasional company of inmates who had been awake too long. That night, I was assigned to monitor the security cameras in the control room. I sat in front of a bank of screens, each displaying different areas of the prison. Most of the screens showed nothing out of the ordinary, just inmates locked in their cells or pacing in the common areas. But one screen drew my attention. In the corner of the monitor, I saw a figure huddled in the shadows of cell 13B. It was an empty cell, or at least it should have been. My heart quickened as I watched the figure, its form shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, but there was something undeniably sinister about its presence. I radioed one of the guards on the floor to check it out. He unlocked the cell door and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. I watched the screen, waiting for him to emerge, but he didn't. Static filled the screen, and the other guards rushed to the control room, their faces etched with concern. We tried to communicate with the guard in cell 13B, but there was no response. Panicking, we rushed to the cell, but what we found inside chilled us to the bone. The guard was suspended in the air, his body contorted in unnatural angles. Blood oozed from his mouth, and his eyes were wide with terror. We struggled to lower him to the ground, but his body was limp and lifeless. As we frantically called for medical assistance, the lights in the cell flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting a sickly red glow that painted the scene in macabre hues. The guard's death was ruled as an unexplained accident, but we knew the truth. There was something malevolent in that cell, something that defied explanation. It was as if the very essence of the prison had taken on a life of its own, a dark force that reveled in tormenting those who dared to enter its domain. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the once familiar sounds of the prison took on a sinister edge. I started hearing whispers in the dead of night, voices that spoke of unspeakable horrors and whispered promises of doom. One night, as I made my rounds, I saw it, the figure from the security camera. It stood in the hallway, a shadowy silhouette with eyes that burned like smoldering coals. My flashlight's beam passed right through it, as if it were nothing more than mist. My heart raced, and I backed away slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the air with dread. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell my fellow guards about the apparition, but they dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a byproduct of working the night shift for too long. But I knew the truth. I had come face to face with something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed the prison as its own. I couldn't take it any longer. The night terrors, the whispers, and the constant feeling of being watched pushed me to the brink. I handed in my resignation and left Black Ridge Penitentiary behind, but the horrors of that night continue to haunt me. Every night I hear the whispers, and I see the shadowy figure in my dreams. I know that I can never truly escape the darkness of that place, for it has become a part of me, a lingering nightmare that refuses to let go. And as I lie awake in my bed, I can't help but wonder if the prison itself is still watching, still waiting for its next victim to claim. My name is Ben, and I've been working the night shift at the Oakwood convenience store for the past 6 months. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I was grateful for it. Little did I know that my time on the night shift would become a harrowing descent into darkness. The store was located at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by trees that cast eerie shadows in the moonlight. Most nights, there were no customers after midnight, and I was left to my own devices, tending to the shelves and occasionally zoning out in the dimly lit back room. One particularly frigid winter night, as the clock struck midnight, I heard the unmistakable jingle of the doorbell signaling the arrival of a customer. I looked up from my task and saw a man entering the store. He wore a heavy coat, his face obscured by the hood. "Late-night shopper," I muttered to myself, offering a polite nod. He wandered the aisles aimlessly, his presence unsettling me. I resumed my work, keeping an eye on him through the surveillance cameras. As he approached the counter with a few items, I noticed something odd. His reflection in the security mirror showed no face beneath the hood. My heart quickened, and a shiver ran down my spine. I dismissed it as a trick of the dim lighting, but unease settled in the pit of my stomach. "Anything else I can help you with?" I asked, my voice quivering slightly. He didn't respond. Instead, he handed me a crumpled bill and continued to stare at me from beneath the hood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them piercing into my soul. "Change?" I asked, almost whispering, as I handed him his change. Without a word, he took the money and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he paused. The doorbell jingled again, but this time, it was as if the sound came from a distant, echoing chamber. I blinked, and in that split second, the man vanished. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. It was as if he had never been there at all. Unease turned to fear as I rushed to the door, throwing it open and scanning the empty parking lot. There was no sign of the man, no trace of where he could have gone. It was impossible. I locked the door and returned to the counter, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Had I just witnessed a ghost? Or was it a hallucination brought on by the long hours and isolation of the night shift? As I pondered the inexplicable encounter, a sense of dread washed over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had visited the store that night, something that defied all rational explanation. Hours passed, and I couldn't focus on my work. Every sound, the creaking of the shelves, the rustling of packaging, seemed to take on a sinister tone. The surveillance cameras displayed nothing out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I heard it, the faint, distant sound of the doorbell jingling. I turned to see the hooded figure standing at the entrance once again. This time, there was no doubt. It was the same man, his face still hidden beneath the hood. He approached the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He raised a gloved hand, and in his palm he held a small, withered rose. Its petals were blackened and brittle, and it emitted a foul odor that filled the air. "Take it," he whispered, his voice like a frigid breeze. I recoiled, refusing to touch the grotesque offering. But as I turned away, I heard his chilling words. "You can't escape," he hissed. "You're trapped here just like me." I spun around, but he had vanished once again, leaving only the foul stench of the decaying rose behind. I quit my job that very morning, unable to shake the terror of that night. I never returned to the Oakwood convenience store, but the memory of the hooded figure and his ominous words continue to haunt my nightmares. I often wonder if he was a restless spirit or something far more malevolent. One thing is certain: I'll never know the true nature of the terror that visited me during that long night shift, but I'm grateful to have left it behind.